Greetings, friends. Is the world overpopulated? The answer to this question is nuanced. It could be easy to look at the world and conclude that there are too many people. All the poverty, starvation, lack of fresh water, environmental degradation. Isn't this because there's too many people competing for too few resources? Perhaps this is a factor, but it is only one possible starting point. You could just as easily reason that mankind's sinfulness manifests all of these problems. He cannot treat his fellow man well, and so follow all of the other degradations of the world. Some say the planet can only support so many humans, our ecological footprint, as they say, as if the world is a giant bank and everyone by breathing or by eating spends some money that they are graciously gifted by this Mother Earth bank. Putting the planet over human life is perverse, but we don't want to get caught in a dialectic of us versus the planet. As I wrote the script for this video, I came to see that the question of overpopulation in the world assumes that people are just in the world without asking how they are in the world. You could have a country in which the territory is empty and wild, but everyone lives crowded into one huge city which can't support such a number, and the surrounding environment suffers. The experience of most of the people in this country would be overcrowding, perhaps overpopulation, but the numbers of people in the city are not linearly connected to the physical area. The physical area does influence a lot. Obviously, fertile areas tend to support more people than deserts, but physical area is not everything. Look at Los Angeles or Las Vegas, huge cities in the midst of a desert. It is easier to focus on the notion of overcrowding than it is the notion of overpopulation, because we can all relate to having been in overcrowded places, but overpopulation is an abstract concept which says there are too many people in a given country, regardless of where they are located or how they live. The lack of nuance is useful to the elites, so they use it as an ideological weapon. In my everyday experience living in Toronto, the place is clearly overcrowded. They destroy the old housing and they build huge bland condos everywhere. It puts strain on public transportation, it raises the price of rent, the price of food. It raises property values too, so those with property are somewhat satiated despite the negatives. In other regards, Toronto is a depopulated ghost town. It has been depopulated of Christians, it has been depopulated of whites, and many green spaces, certainly along river valleys, remain unfrequented by people despite their proximity to so-called densely populated neighborhoods. We've brought in masses of people who are sheepish about exploring their surroundings. But even in the crowded areas, you feel alone most of the time. You are anonymous. Anonymity is a form of isolation, the same kind of isolation we might associate with a rural place with few inhabitants. And yet here in the city you can have the same isolation, maybe even more of it. Maybe people in rural areas get to know their neighbors, but that isn't the case in the city. I grew up in the suburbs and I didn't know most of the people who lived on my street. Now I'm living in another neighborhood of the city and I don't know practically anyone here. The house across the street might be as random as a house 500 yards away or across the city. I've seen densely packed cities in the third world. India would be a good example. All this poverty, surely if there were less people in India, there would be less suffering. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. I'd say probably not. I mean, what makes you think it would be better in India if they had drastically fewer numbers? I mean, let's say India was reduced all the way down to only 50 million people. Because now it's like, currently it's well over 1 billion. But so if they reduced it all the way down to 50 million people, do you think that the Brahmin caste is now going to eat with the untouchable caste? No, these social divisions would persist. And just like in the past, when there weren't as many people in India, they still had this basic way of life in India. The same could be said of China. And if I remember correctly, the Chinese emperors were always concerned with overpopulation over a large portion of this country's history. The state bureaucracy thought they already had enough subjects. They had to worry about peasant revolts when there wasn't enough food. And this manifested itself most recently in China's one-child policy, where they were encouraging couples to have only one child, although this policy is now ended. The English cleric, scholar, and economist Thomas Malthus, born in 1766 and died in 1834, is held in high regard by many of today's elites. Malthus claimed that when resources are plentiful, people will have too many offspring and they'll mess everything up, so their numbers have got to be limited. There were things he was right about, but he failed to predict many things like the Industrial Revolution, and how something like this Industrial Revolution could change a country's ability to support more people. Today, the global elites push an agenda of depopulation, of decreased sterility, and increased abortions, and they support lifestyles and values that tend to lower human flourishing. Humans are more easy to control when their numbers are limited. Such millions and billions of people lend themselves to mass movements in politics which the elites are uncomfortable with. Their animus against physical bodies is like their animus against physical cash in the economy. For economic transactions conducted beyond their oversight is a form of power they do not control. They've got to control the entire economy and the entire culture simultaneously. Total control, a zero-sum game. There's a huge population boom in Africa. People talk about how it's made possible by foreign aid, and that if the aid dried up, then Africa would plunge into chaos. This is a precarious economic situation, and I acknowledge that in some of its urban areas, Africa is indeed overcrowded, and maybe overpopulated, you could say. But from a spatial perspective, Africa on the whole isn't necessarily overpopulated. There's plenty of space in Africa. It's not like China or India where there are literally people everywhere. Africa is a big place. Maybe most of the fertile land is already occupied, but I doubt it. In some cases like the Congo, there's plenty of good land, but just either war or famine is preventing development. Or in other cases, there's forested areas. Look at Gabon. There's almost nobody living there, and it's a huge forest. Not that I say tearing down rainforest is great, just that there are huge tracts of land in Africa which are undeveloped. I mean, you could say the same thing about the Amazon rainforest. Maybe the global machine wants to turn this land in Africa and the Amazon into soy fields. Maybe it's better for us to leave it as woodland or forest, but what do you tell the local man who's building his farm there and he's feeding his family from it? Every human being is made in the image of God. Every human is special in a way that an animal is not. There is the command of God to be fruitful and multiply, given that this means virtuous Christians. If you're raising degenerates, I doubt whether be fruitful and multiply would apply. Nonetheless, every human life has the potential to participate in God's energies, no matter how fallen we are, and we should never be deceived into thinking that decreasing the presence of human life is a good thing in itself. Maybe in certain situations a lower population can be a good. For instance, God periodically chastised the Israelites and left but a remnant of them alive. It was beyond their control. People don't plan to lower their population. It happens though. This is why we have to be deeply careful when dealing with people who advocate for depopulation. Men and women are biologically designed to reproduce. By nature, we are most happy and most useful to society when this is done on the foundation of a traditional Christian marriage, one man, one woman. We have it in ourselves to build and create society, and this generally involves having numerous children. But if we want that society to be a civilization, it would be better off promoting one husband, one wife with their offspring, and using this and having this as the fundamental unit of social organization. Societies that break this traditional family structure either survive only in barbaric conditions or they don't survive at all. They are outdone by societies which did follow the pattern of encouraging traditional monogamous marriages with their attendant families. But for any people, barbaric or not, even in the recent past, it would have been necessary to have numerous children. This was the case for everyone. And this was so because so many of the children died in their first few years. They never made it to adulthood. This meant that the naturally weak and sick tended to be weeded out over time. They went out of the gene pool. But in the 19th century, this began to change. Improvements in medicine meant that far more children now survived into adulthood. This included the ones with mental and physical disabilities and other maladaptive personality traits. As Dr. Edward Dutton calls them, the spiteful mutants then eventually took over the society as we are seeing today. They're mutants because they're not well suited to the real world, and they're spiteful because they resent what is good, beautiful, and true. We're seeing the revenge of the nerds, the tyranny of the marginalized. Eventually, the spiteful mutants die off because they don't have enough offspring, and the society resets itself. Stronger and healthier peoples begin reproducing again. In summary, it's not necessarily that the world has too many people, it's that it has a population imbalance. There's too much crowding into cities, and some areas are clearly going to have trouble getting enough food and water. Furthermore, we live in an age of mass migration to the Western world, which mixes the various peoples of the world in a cauldron. On top of this, we've got governments and corporations giving money and encouraging the growth of certain groups while they try to limit the numbers of other groups. Finally, due in part to these deliberate policies to reduce the size of some populations, and in part to the advances of the Industrial Revolution, we've witnessed the rise of the spiteful mutants in some of the targeted groups, especially amongst people of European descent. Hasta luego, amigos.